time to time.
Frankfurt police confirming one student died and another was transported to the hospital in stable but critical condition after shots rang out at a dorm, officials say, in the heart of the 1,000-plus acre campus with 2,200 students. It happened just after 3 in the afternoon.
I heard they had 2 victims. They were attempting to from the transport.
Anthony Jones heard the gunfire.
I just heard 2 shots and seen out the window up there. I just seen everybody running down. About over there, I ran down, seen what was happening.
With the help of campus police and the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, authorities secured the campus and have a suspect in custody.
One individual who is not a Kentucky State University student is in custody. Frankfurt police believe this to be an isolated incident, and there are no active safety concerns on campus at this time. The other 2 individuals involved were current Kentucky State University.
You did it again. The script called you out, and you saw that student fall, and now here we are, staring into the unimaginable abyss of American failure, watching as this horror unfolds like every single horror before it, and knowing deep in our philosophical marrow that we chose this horror unfolds like every single horror before it, and knowing deep in our philosophical marrow that we chose this horror unfolds like that this is not accident or inevitability, but a grotesque political decision, renewed every single day that Republican politicians wake up and decide to protect gun manufacturers instead of children. Kentucky State University, one of the 2 historically black colleges and universities in Kentucky, became a war zone during finals week when a non-student gunman murdered 1 student and critically wounded another at a residence hall. And the most bone-chilling part isn't even the gunfire echoing across a campus where young people were supposed to be cramming for exams and dreaming about winter break. It's the casual bureaucratic language authorities deployed afterward. That sterile phrase about this being an isolated incident with no active safety concerns, as if you can just arrest 1 shooter and declare mission accomplished while the entire infrastructure of violence remains perfectly intact and ready to detonate again tomorrow. Wait until you hear what's coming next, because this isn't just about Kentucky State. This is about a nation that has normalized mass slaughter to such a degree that we've developed an entire lexicon of euphemisms to avoid confronting what we're actually doing to our children. Kentucky State University has now become the site of the 73rd shooting on school grounds this year, the 73rd time in 2025 alone that gunfire erupted where students gather to learn, and we're supposed to accept this as background noise, as the price of freedom, as something other than a moral catastrophe that would have toppled governments in any other democracy on earth. Firearms are now the leading cause of death among youth ages 1 to 19, which means we've constructed a society where bullets kill more children than car accidents or cancer or any disease, where the most dangerous thing a kid can do is simply exist in America, and Republican politicians respond to this carnage with theatrical performances of concern, followed by absolutely nothing. But here's the bombshell that's going to make your blood boil, because it gets so much worse than legislative inaction. It's active sabotage of every single attempt to address this crisis. Senate Republicans blocked efforts to pass an assault weapons ban when Senator John Barrasso objected to unanimous consent, despite Democratic senators citing harrowing statistics of gun violence in America, and Utah Republican Senator Mike Lee immediately objected to universal background checks, even though 92% of Americans favor requiring background checks for all firearm sales, which exposes the rotten truth at the heart of our democracy, that this isn't about representing constituents or protecting communities, but about serving the insatiable demands of gun manufacturers and the NRA death cult that has purchased the entire Republican Party wholesale. MAGA Republicans continue to block basic guidelines that would make our communities safer, because their ideology demands blood sacrifice on the altar of an absolutist Second Amendment interpretation that the founders would have found psychotic, and every single day they maintain this obstruction another American dies from gun violence that could have been prevented. And you want to know what makes this Kentucky State shooting even more devastating? Hold on to your seats, because this detail illuminates the intersectional nightmare of American gun violence. The shooting was the second in 4 months in the same area of the university, as someone fired multiple shots from a vehicle near the same residence hall in August, and Kentucky State is a public historically black university with about 2,200 students, which means this community has been terrorized repeatedly while gunfire on school grounds occurs most often at schools with a high proportion of students of color, disproportionately affecting black students. This isn't random. This is the predictable consequence of a society that has always valued black lives less than white lives, that allows violence to saturate communities of color while deploying massive resources to protect wealthy white suburbs, that watches HBCU after HBCU experience shootings and responds with the same empty thoughts and prayers that wouldn't be tolerated for 5 seconds if this were happening at elite, predominantly white institutions. Now let me tell you what Senate Republicans did just recently that will make you want to scream into the void of American democracy's failure, because Senate Republicans blocked an assault weapons ban along with universal background checks for a class of weapon designed solely for the slaughter of people, and they wouldn't even let the legislation come up for a vote. They didn't defeat it through democratic deliberation. They strangled it in its crib using procedural tactics that prevent the American people from even witnessing their representatives debate whether children should be allowed to attend school without fearing for their lives. At least 10 of the 17 deadliest mass shootings in United States history saw a gunman wield an AR-15-style rifle, which means we know exactly which weapons are being used to perpetrate these massacres, and Republicans have decided that the profits of gun manufacturers matter more than the lives being shredded by these instruments of war. But wait, because it gets even more infuriating when you examine what's actually in the Republican policy agenda for guns. Congressional GOP lawmakers have introduced more than 24 gun bills this year, and experts say the party is well positioned to turn its priorities into law. And what are those priorities? Not universal background checks, not assault weapons bans, not red flag laws that could save lives, but rather letting people carry concealed guns in all 50 states regardless of each state's permitting standards, loosening the National Firearms Act of 1934, which restricts machine guns and silencers, and attempting to restructure the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives or abolish it altogether. This is the Republican vision for America. More guns in more places carried by more people with less training and less oversight, a Hobbesian nightmare where every public space becomes a potential shootout, and we're all supposed to accept that as the natural order rather than the manufactured hellscape it actually is. Let me hit you with another revelation that exposes the systematic Republican campaign to ensure we never solve this crisis, because House Republicans voted on November 15th to prohibit the government from funding research by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on the causes and prevention of gun violence, with 216 GOP lawmakers backing the ban, while all Democrats present and 4 Republicans voted against it. Think about that for 1 second. Republicans are so committed to protecting gun industry profits that they won't even allow scientists to study the problem. They've decided that knowledge itself is too dangerous, because it might lead to solutions that reduce gun sales, so they're actively blocking research into a public health crisis that kills tens of thousands of Americans every year. This is willful ignorance elevated to governing philosophy. This is epistemic violence designed to maintain profitable carnage. This is what happens when an entire political party becomes a wholly owned subsidiary of weapons manufacturers. And here comes the part that should radicalize anyone who claims to care about children or education or basic human dignity, because while students at Kentucky State University were running for their lives during finals week, the shooting upended students' final exams of the semester before they go on winter break, and University President Kofi Siakakop called it a senseless tragedy that has left the community mourning the loss of one of its students. And what was the Republican response? Silence, deflection, the same tired talking points about mental health that they never fund, and armed teachers they enthusiastically promote despite a study finding no evidence that the presence of resource officers in schools lessened the severity of school shooting incidents, with no indication that armed teachers would prove any more effective. They want to turn schools into armed fortresses, rather than address the fundamental problem that there are too many guns, and it's too easy for dangerous people to get them. They want to traumatize children with active shooter drills and fortified bunkers, rather than implement the universal background checks and assault weapons bans that work in every other developed nation on Earth. Now buckle up, because I'm about to drop the connection that ties all of this together into one coherent portrait of Republican nihilism. Project 2025's mandate for leadership has outlined an extreme policy vision to put power and profits back in the hands of the corporate gun lobby at the expense of public safety by undermining the effectiveness of federal law enforcement and replacing experts tasked with protecting the American people with far-right loyalists. And in May 2024, Project 2025 had a booth at the annual National Rifle Association convention. This isn't subtle. This is the blueprint for turning America into a gun-saturated failed state, where the only law is violence and the only right that matters is the right to own weapons of war. And the Biden administration did more to reduce gun violence than any administration in decades, through the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, and creating the first White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, with these popular policies leading to historic declines in gun violence that Republicans want to reverse by making it easier for anyone to carry guns in sensitive public places. That's the choice before us. continue the progress that's actually saving lives, or return to Republican governance that treats gun deaths as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of ideological purity and corporate profits. Listen to what Republicans are actively blocking right now, because this list is indictment of their entire moral framework. The Republican Study Committee budget calls for eliminating popular public safety policies with bipartisan support, including defunding red flag laws, eliminating Centers for Disease Control and Prevention funding for firearm research, and destroying firearm records used by law enforcement to hold shooters accountable. The Concealed Carry Reciprocity Act would overrule state laws on carrying concealed guns, making it so almost anyone can carry firearms in public, forcing states to allow individuals from permitless carry states who may have violent criminal histories and zero gun safety training to carry concealed guns in public, and making it harder for law enforcement to prevent violence. This is federalism in reverse. This is using federal power to prevent states from protecting their own citizens. This is the Republican vision of liberty, which means the freedom to be shot at Walmart, or in your college dorm or at elementary school, while Republican politicians collect their NRA donations and perform their kayfabe outrage about anything except the actual guns doing the killing. And you absolutely need to hear about what happened with the legislative response to previous school shootings, because the pattern reveals everything. The last major action from Congress on gun laws was in June 2022, about a month after the Robb Elementary School massacre in Uvalde, Texas, that killed 19 students and 2 teachers, producing the $13.2 billion Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, backed by Democrats and 15 Senate Republicans, including Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. But a weapons ban like the one pushed by Biden has little to no chance of being approved on Capitol Hill, where Republicans have rejected it. That was the absolute floor of what could pass, the bare minimum compromise after children were massacred in their classroom. And Republicans have spent every moment since trying to undermine even that modest achievement, because Senator Cornyn, who negotiated the 2022 gun violence prevention law, now has 41 Senate Republicans who back his joint resolution to stop an ATF rule expanding background checks based on that law. They won't even honor their own compromises. They negotiate in bad faith, and then immediately work to sabotage any regulation that might save lives. And this is why we can't have nice things like children who don't get shot at school, because one entire political party has decided that gun manufacturer profits are sacred and human life is negotiable. Let me take you deeper into the hellscape of Republican gun policy, because Republicans added a provision to the budget bill that would overturn part of the 1934 National Firearms Act by scrapping a $200 federal excise tax on silencers and removing them from registration, which will allow the gun industry to profit and criminals to elude law enforcement as violent crime and gun deaths will increase. And silencers on guns make it harder for ordinary civilians and police to hear the sound, see the flash, and quickly detect the location of the shooter, thus facilitating mass shootings, as happened in Virginia Beach in 2019, when a gunman who shot and killed 12 people used a silencer, and at first those present didn't even know that a shooting was underway, with some of them beginning to run but not knowing which way to go, because they hadn't heard the gunfire. This is what Republicans want, to make mass shootings more effective by allowing shooters to kill more people before anyone realizes what's happening, to give assassins and terrorists the tools they need to maximize casualties. And they're doing this in a budget bill, hoping nobody notices while they slash Medicaid and gut social services, because the cruelty is the point and the death is the feature, not the bug. Now I need you to understand the scope of gun violence in American schools, because the numbers alone should constitute a national emergency. According to the K-12 school shooting database, there have been 209 shootings so far in 2025. The Washington Post reported 426 K-12 school shootings in the United States since the Columbine High School massacre in 1999, with over 80,000 United States children and adolescents dying from gun violence since then. And between 2009 and 2018, there were a combined total of 5 recorded school shootings in G7 member countries: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, while the United States averaged 6 school shootings every 2.5 months during the same 10-year period, with firearm mortality rates among children and adolescents at least 10 times higher in the United States compared to other high-income nations. We are an outlier. We are a failed state when it comes to protecting children from gun violence, and the only variable that explains this divergence from every other wealthy democracy is the number of guns and the ease of access to them. Yet Republicans insist with straight faces that the problem is literally anything else, that we need more religion or fewer video games or armed teachers or better mental health care, that they refuse to fund anything to avoid confronting the simple truth that more guns equals more death. And here's where it gets personal, because research documents how school shootings have long-term cascading negative consequences for the academic labor market and mental health outcomes of the more than 390,000 student survivors, with being exposed to a school shooting reducing the likelihood students graduate from high school and obtain a bachelor's degree by 3.4% and 14.6% respectively, and finding that survivors are less likely to ever be employed, and if employed earn $2,600 less annually, on average amounting to a present discounted value of over $100,000 in lost lifetime earnings. This is what gun violence costs. Not just the immediate horror of watching classmates die, but the destruction of entire futures, the shattering of educational trajectories and career prospects and mental health, the creation of a traumatized generation that will carry these wounds forever, while Republicans offer nothing except more guns and more violence and more trauma, because their political coalition depends on maintaining the culture of fear that drives gun sales and conservative voting. Let me tell you about the research suppression that enables all of this, because knowledge is power, and Republicans know that research demonstrating the effectiveness of gun regulations threatens their entire ideological edifice. Tracking school shootings in the United States was made more difficult by the passage of the Dickey Amendment in 1996, which mandated that no Centers for Disease Control and Prevention funds may be used to advocate or promote gun control, although this does not mean the CDC has stopped researching gun violence, and instead Congress relies on independent research done by nonpartisan organizations for getting data on gun violence. They created a research blackout for decades. They prevented the premier public health agency from studying gun violence as a public health crisis, and even after that prohibition was loosened, the CDC already grants less funding for gun violence research than for nearly every other leading cause of death in America, and Speaker Johnson and gun lobby-backed House Republicans are hell-bent on finding new ways to backtrack on advances made to keep communities safe. This is by design. This is strategic ignorance deployed as a weapon against regulatory reform. This is what a captured political party does when it serves industry interests instead of public welfare. But let's talk about what actually works, because we have mountains of evidence from other countries and from American states that have implemented stronger gun laws. Legislative restrictions to limit children's ability to buy and carry firearms and to increase safe storage of guns work with comprehensive reviews of laws which limit access to guns for people under 18, showing that those laws reduce the rate of gun carrying and the frequency of student reports of threats or injuries on school property by almost 20%. And a 2023 meta-analysis of more than 150 studies of United States gun control policies found unequivocally that access prevention laws are effective at reducing firearm deaths. We know what works. We have the research despite Republican efforts to suppress it. We have the evidence from Australia and Japan, and the United Kingdom and Canada, and every other nation that decided children's lives matter more than gun industry profits. Yet Republicans block every single proposal that might move us toward sanity, because they've constructed an entire political identity around unlimited gun rights that cannot accommodate the obvious truth that regulations save lives. And now the truly sickening part about how Republicans have responded to the school shooting crisis. Hold on, because this will make you want to flip a table. Trump has passionately and persistently discussed his desire to arm teachers and put more guns in schools with Project 2025, making this vision a reality by allowing states to use federal money currently allocated for low-income school districts to arm teachers, and Trump also proposed giving teachers who carry weapons a bonus and providing federal funding for schools to hire veterans, retired police officers, and other trained gun owners as armed school guards, while Agenda 47 proposes funding schools that allow teachers to carry concealed weapons in classroom. This is the Republican solution. Turn schools into armed camps where teachers are expected to engage in gunfights with active shooters, instead of teaching literature and mathematics. Traumatize children by surrounding them with weapons and armed guards, and strip resources from low-income schools to buy guns rather than books or counselors or smaller class sizes. This is educational malpractice elevated to policy. This is what happens when you let people who hate public education make decisions about school safety, and it reveals the fundamental Republican contempt for teachers and students and learning itself. Here's what we know about the Kentucky State shooting specifically that should inform our understanding of this crisis. The shooting occurred near Whitney M. Young Jr. Hall, a residence hall on the south side of the campus, with 2 Kentucky State University students shot in the incident, which means these students were in their dorm. They were in the place that should have been safest. They were probably studying for finals or decompressing after exams or just trying to live their lives, and a non-student with a gun turned their home into a crime scene. Frankfort police said Jacob Lee Bard was booked into jail on murder and first-degree assault charges in connection with the shooting, with Bard from Evansville, Indiana, about 150 miles west of Frankfort, which raises questions about how easily he obtained the weapon, how he accessed campus, what systems failed to prevent this tragedy. But we already know the fundamental answer, which is that we live in a society saturated with guns, where anyone can arm themselves and commit violence whenever they choose, because Republicans have systematically dismantled every barrier that might prevent weapons from falling into the wrong hands. Listen to what the research shows about the mental health and academic impacts, because this extends far beyond the immediate victims. Exposure to school shootings leads to persistent increases in youth antidepressant use, and high fatality shootings substantially elevate the rates of suicide and overdose deaths among survivors. Youth exposed to senseless acts of violence in their communities suffer serious negative mental health consequences, attend school less regularly, and perform worse on standardized tests. We're creating a generation of traumatized young people whose entire educational experience has been shaped by the constant threat of violence, who practice active shooter drills with the same frequency their parents practiced fire drills, who have to consider exit strategies and hiding places as basic components of attending school, and Republicans look at this nightmare and say we need more guns, we need armed teachers, we need to fortify schools like military installations, rather than address the root cause, which is that there are 400 million guns in civilian hands in America, and we've made it obscenely easy for anyone, including violent criminals and domestic abusers and people in mental health crisis, to obtain weapons designed for maximum lethality. And I need to return to the intersection of gun violence and racial injustice, because Tuesday's incident is the latest HBCU attacked in recent months, after 2 others experienced shootings in October during homecoming, which means historically black colleges and universities are being targeted repeatedly, are experiencing a pattern of violence that demands federal intervention and resources and protection. Yet the response has been muted at best because America has always tolerated higher levels of violence in black communities, has always accepted as normal the gunfire and death that would provoke immediate action if it were happening in wealthy white areas. This is environmental racism. This is the predictable consequence of a society that has never valued black life equally, and gun policy in America cannot be separated from the racial dynamics that shape every aspect of how violence is distributed and responded to and grieved. Let me tell you what makes the Kentucky State shooting a microcosm of our national failure, because every element of this tragedy has been repeated hundreds of times with the same result, which is nothing. Due to the shooting, Kentucky State University said it will be suspending all classes' final exams and campus activities for the remainder of the week, with school officials saying students may return home if they choose to do so, and counseling and support services available for students, faculty, and staff who may have been impacted. Which sounds compassionate, but is actually an indictment, because these services shouldn't be necessary. Students shouldn't need trauma counseling because a gunman invaded their campus. Finals shouldn't be canceled because someone with easy access to weapons decided to commit murder. And the fact that we've normalized this pattern where shootings happen, and then we offer thoughts and prayers and counseling, and then we do absolutely nothing to prevent the next shooting, is a collective moral failure that historians will judge harshly. Now let's talk about the staggering hypocrisy of Republican rhetoric around gun rights and freedom, because Senator John Barrasso argued that Americans have a constitutional right to own a firearm, and every day people across Wyoming responsibly use their Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms, while claiming Democrats are demanding that the American people give up their liberty, which frames any gun regulation as tyranny, while completely ignoring that 10 states, including Washington State, Illinois, Delaware, California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, as well as Washington, D.C., already effectively have assault weapons bans, though their efforts are curtailed by the weaker regulations of surrounding states. The Second Amendment isn't unlimited. It's never been unlimited. Supreme Court precedent and constitutional tradition support reasonable regulations, and Republicans know this, but they've made gun rights into a religious issue that cannot be questioned without risking political excommunication, so they invoke liberty and freedom while defending a system that ensures tens of thousands of Americans die every year from preventable gun violence. And here comes the really damning part about legislative obstruction that proves Republicans are acting in bad faith. A vote on domestic terrorism legislation received 47 votes short of the 60 needed to take up the bill, with all Republicans voting against it, and a small bipartisan group of senators met searching for any compromise that could win approval in Congress, narrowing to 3 topics, including background checks for guns purchased online or at gun shows, red flag laws designed to keep guns away from those who could harm themselves or others, and programs to bolster security at schools and other buildings, which sounds promising, except most of the congressional efforts on guns have been stymied in recent years by Republican opposition, as the party has largely united to block new gun control measures and prevent that legislation from reaching the 60-vote threshold needed for most bills to advance in the Senate. They don't want solutions. They want the issue. They want to campaign on fear and freedom while ensuring nothing changes because change would threaten the gun industry profits that fund their campaigns and the culture war narratives that animate their base. Let me tell you what happened immediately after this Kentucky state shooting, because the response reveals everything about how we've normalized carnage. There is no further threat to the community after campus police officers responded to the shooting immediately and arrested the suspect moments after the first gunfire. And by the time Frankfurt police arrived within 4 minutes of the first 911 call, the scene had been secured and a suspect was arrested as the school remained on lockdown. Which sounds like a success story about rapid response except for the minor detail that one student is dead and another critically wounded. That fast police response cannot undo bullets fired, that security measures and lockdowns and armed officers are palliative care for a disease that requires preventive treatment. We've accepted that shootings will happen, and focused all our energy on response rather than prevention, because prevention requires confronting the gun industry, and Republicans have decided that's politically impossible. And let's examine what Republicans have actually accomplished on gun policy when they held power, because Trump weakened the Brady background check system by revoking President Biden's zero-tolerance policy under which the licenses of gun dealers could be canceled if they failed to run background checks as required or sold guns to prohibited people, and Trump's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives would even allow irresponsible and dangerous gun sellers who lost their licenses because of willful violations of the law to get back into business by simply reapplying. This is the Republican agenda in action, making it easier for corrupt gun dealers to operate, removing accountability for those who sell weapons to criminals, dismantling the already inadequate regulatory structure that's supposed to prevent guns from reaching dangerous people. The Trump administration recently settled a court case initiated by the National Association for Gun Rights that will allow the sale of a trigger device that replaces the standard trigger of the AR-15 rifle and makes it fire much more rapidly. They're literally enabling weapons modifications that make mass shootings more lethal while claiming to support law enforcement and public safety. And this contradiction would be laughable if it weren't getting people killed. You absolutely must understand the economic dimension of this crisis, because in 2022 alone, 4,603 children and adolescents lost their lives to gun violence, and another 27,902 were shot by a firearm. Gun violence destabilizes schools and causes them to spend billions of scarce dollars on security measures that could be much more productively applied to academic investments. We're diverting massive resources from education to security theater. We're spending money on metal detectors and armed guards and fortified buildings instead of teachers and counselors and books. We're treating the symptoms while Republicans block any attempt to address the disease, and the opportunity cost of this is staggering when you consider how those billions could have been invested in reducing class sizes or providing mental health services or updating curriculum or paying teachers a living wage. Now let me connect all of this to the broader Republican assault on public safety and democratic governance, because key themes in the authoritarian playbook include preventing federal law enforcement from enforcing the laws on the books, allowing the proliferation of ghost guns, and defunding proven public safety solutions that prevent or respond to violent crime. And the latest federal spending bill advanced by House Republicans proposes nearly $1 billion in cuts to the United States Department of Justice's budget, which would eliminate thousands of law enforcement positions and all funding for community violence intervention programs. They claim to support law enforcement while defunding the agencies tasked with enforcing gun laws. They claim to oppose crime while making it easier for criminals to obtain untraceable weapons. They claim to care about victims while cutting funding for programs that help communities heal from violence. And this pattern of contradiction reveals that Republican gun policy isn't about safety or freedom or constitutional rights, but about serving the financial interests of weapons manufacturers, regardless of the human cost. Here's what progressives need to understand about this moment, and why the Kentucky state shooting demands a fundamentally different response than the performative grief we usually see. Our nation's prioritization of personal rights over the common good is not only a major barrier to gun law reform, it is the very soil in which America's epidemic of violence grows. While more restrictive laws are needed, the problem goes beyond access to guns, with our nation's prioritization of personal rights over the common good being not only a major barrier to gun law reform, but the very soil in which America's epidemic of violence grows. This is about capitalism and individualism, and a political culture that treats collective responsibility as socialism. This is about a society that has elevated property rights and gun rights above human rights and the right to live without fear of violence. And any solution has to grapple with these deeper structural problems rather than simply tinkering with regulations that Republicans will immediately obstruct. And I need to tell you about what's at stake in the coming legislative battles, because if Congress enacts concealed carry reciprocity research, strongly suggests that the United States will experience increases in violent crime, petty disputes escalating into shootings and unsolved crimes, which means the Republican agenda will actively make America more dangerous, will turn every public space into a potential shootout, will ensure that conflicts that could be resolved through conversation instead escalate to lethal violence because everyone is armed and afraid. Concealed carry reciprocity legislation would roll back states' gun safety measures and increase the risk of gun violence for everyone, meaning communities couldn't keep loaded and hidden guns out of parks, grocery stores, or childcare centers. And if Trump's agenda is implemented, states that passed universal background checks, red flag laws, and safe storage requirements will have this progress undone. This is the stakes of the next election. This is what Republicans will do with power, and anyone who cares about gun violence prevention needs to understand that voting has consequences, and Republican victories mean more dead students and more grieving families and more communities torn apart by preventable tragedies. Listen to what we know about effective interventions, because easy access to firearms in the home results in high rates of unintentional gun deaths among children, youth suicides, and school shootings, with studies showing that between 70 and 90% of guns used in youth suicides, unintentional shootings among children, and school shootings perpetrated by shooters under the age of 18 are acquired from the home or the homes of relatives or friends, which means child access prevention laws can help prevent unintentional shootings and gun suicides. And child access prevention and safe storage laws promote responsible firearm storage practices and hold gun owners accountable for failing to take simple yet important measures to prevent guns from being used by children. These solutions exist. They work. They're supported by large majorities of Americans, including gun owners, yet Republicans block them because even modest regulations that might save children's lives are treated as unacceptable infringements on liberty, and this tells you everything about whose lives Republicans actually value. And here's the final indictment that ties together all these threads into one coherent narrative of Republican moral bankruptcy. University President Kofi Siakakpo called the shooting, which happened during finals week, a senseless tragedy that has left the community mourning the loss of one of its students. And that word senseless is actually wrong, because this tragedy makes perfect sense when you understand the political economy of gun violence in America. It makes sense that a country with more guns than people experiences more gun deaths. It makes sense that a political party captured by the gun industry blocks all regulations. It makes sense that students keep dying when we've built a system that prioritizes profit over life. And it will keep making this terrible sense until we build the political power necessary to overcome Republican obstruction and implement the solutions that work everywhere else in the developed world. This Kentucky state shooting wasn't senseless. It was the predictable result of policy choices made by Republican politicians who have decided that your children are acceptable casualties in their culture war. And the only way to honor the student who died is to channel our grief into political action that finally breaks the NRA's stranglehold on American democracy.